Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Today, we'll explore the frozen shadows of the Appalachian Mountains in the center of North Carolina, where the winter of 1898 brought with it a mystery that continues to haunt the records of that remote area, in addition to snow and loneliness. This story will reveal secrets that have been kept hidden for more than a century, so comment where you are watching and get ready. The late 19th century was when North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains were a completely different world. The communities dispersed throughout the mountain slopes lived largely as their ancestors had lived a century before, while cities like Charlotte and Raleigh were starting to see the first signs of modernization with electric streetcars and telegraph lines. The roads were treacherous paths that meandered between oaks and pines that date back hundreds of years. These same paths became dangerous ice and frozen mud traps in the winter. Madison County is in western North Carolina. One of those places where time seemed to stand still was Carolina. With a little over 15,000 residents, it is dispersed throughout deep valleys and peaks covered in mist. Mining on the higher slopes and small tobacco farms were the county's main industries. The county seat marshal was a village with only 300 permanent residents, a stone courthouse that served as the hub of all local justice, and a single main street lined with weather-blackened wooden buildings. The fall of 1897 saw the arrival of Margaret Crowe in Marshall. Nobody was fully aware of her origins, despite the fact that some later documents indicate she may have left Virginia after becoming a widow. Margaret, who was about 35 years old, had intense, unsettling eyes and dark hair that was always pulled back in a severe bun. About 5 miles from the village, on land owned by a local farmer named Josiah Hendress, she rented a small log cabin on the south slope of Mount Mitchell. Even by the time's standards, the cabin was rustic. It had 2 main rooms with logs that weren't properly sealed, walls that, on chilly winter nights, let in the wind. There was a small cast-iron stove, windows with oilcloth over them rather than glass, and a stone fireplace that filled nearly one wall. Margaret occasionally worked as a seamstress for Marshall's wealthier families, helping to pay her $2.50 rent each month. She was skilled at sewing and mending clothing, but she hardly ever talked about her past. During her initial months in the region, Margaret appeared to foster a sense of seclusion. Herself. Once a week, she would travel to Marshall to purchase necessities from Solomon Green's general store, always paying with precisely counted coins. Solomon, a 60-year-old man who knew every person in the county, would tell his wife that Margaret's eyes had an odd quality that he couldn't quite describe but that unnerved him. This general feeling of unease was shared by other residents, but no one could provide specific evidence to support this impression. The 1897-1898 winter season was. The Appalachian Mountains are especially harsh. Snow started to fall in early December and stayed until March, building up to chest-deep layers in some valleys. For weeks at a time, trails were impossible. In order to survive until spring, families on the higher slopes were totally cut off from the outside world and had to rely only on their supplies of smoked meat and dried food. Margaret Crowe started getting guests during that harsh winter. Josiah's wife, Emma Hendress, who lived on the main street, was the first to notice. Margaret's cabin is about a mile away from the farm. As a neighborly gesture, Emma had climbed the hillside one January afternoon to deliver a jar of apple preserves when she noticed a man leaving Margaret's property. His face was concealed by a wide-brimmed hat and a bulky overcoat. Emma waved at him, but he didn't say anything and kept walking down the trail. Over the course of the following few weeks, Emma observed additional guests, always men, always by themselves, and always in the early evening or twilight. She brought this up too. Josiah casually retorted that Margaret was most likely taking sewing orders. Emma, however, was not persuaded. There was something fertile about the way these men came and went, always choosing the darkest hours to avoid being noticed. Thomas Whitfield was a traveler who went through Marshall in February of 1898. Thomas was a traveling salesman for patent medicines who traveled through the mountainous counties of Tennessee and North Carolina, peddling ointments, elixirs, and tonics of questionable effectiveness. He was renowned for having a loose tongue and for frequenting neighborhood taverns where he exchanged stories and gossip for food and drink. Thomas was the one who started spreading unsettling rumors about Margaret Crowe at Henry Bolton's tavern after having a few shots of corn whiskey. Thomas claimed to have spent 3 nights at Margaret's cabin. He described the interior as stuffy and dark, with tallow candles burning in improvised candelabras and an unidentifiable sickly sweet smell. He claimed that Margaret provided more than just sewing. She prepared herbal remedies for a variety of illnesses, performed fortune-telling, and according to even more subdued murmurs, provided other services that Thomas didn't specifically mention, but made evident with suggestive looks and knowing laughter. Like wildfire, rumors circulated throughout Marshall. Suspicions about Margaret soon became damning certainties in a small, intensely religious community where 3 Baptist churches fought for the souls of the faithful. She was a woman living alone in the mountains and entertaining men at night. She was an outsider and had no family. This was sufficient evidence of unethical behavior for the more conservative residents. The first person to speak out against Margaret Crowe was Reverend Ezekiel Morrison. With almost 150 regular members, Mount Zion Baptist Church was Marshall's largest congregation, and Ezekiel served as its pastor. He was 42 years old, had a chest-length graying beard, and was known for being a fiery preacher who wasn't scared to face what he referred to as corruption and sin. Ezekiel took the pulpit and gave a sermon that many people in attendance would never forget on the Sunday following the spread of Thomas Whitfield's rumors. Everyone knew who he was referring to, even though he didn't name Margaret. Ezekiel thundered about the need to drive out impurity before it contaminated the entire congregation, about outsiders bringing corrupt customs into pure communities, and about women living without the protection of fathers or husbands. His tone, as he quoted biblical passages about temptation and piety, his words reverberated off the church's wooden walls. The muffled sobs of a few more sensitive women were the only sound to break the heavy silence that surrounded him after he was done. However, not everyone in Marshall was as outraged as Reverend Morrison. Some people stood up for Margaret, or, at the very least, for her right to live in peace. One of them was Sarah Pritchard, a 53-year-old widow who operated a modest Main Street boarding home. Margaret and Sarah had first met a few months prior when the two had talked extensively about the challenges faced by unmarried women in a male-dominated society, and she had brought a dress for fitting. Instead of seeing Margaret as a sinner, Sarah saw her as a woman attempting to make it through a challenging situation. In her defense, Sarah wasn't by herself. Dr. Benjamin Clark, the county doctor and a 61-year-old Philadelphia Medical School alumnus, also advised against making snap decisions. Margaret had previously received treatment from Dr. Clark after sustaining a deep cut on her hand while working with fabric, and he had discovered that she was a courteous and sensible woman. He openly cautioned that gossip and rumors were not proof, and that the public should exercise caution before damaging someone's reputation based only on innuendo. However, the growing tide of animosity soon overshadowed the voices of moderation. Margaret's circumstances had drastically worsened by March 1898, when the snow finally started to melt and the trails were once again usable. Solomon Green, under pressure from a well-known church. Members told her that he was no longer able to sell her groceries. Josiah Hriss made it plain that he would not be renewing the lease for the cabin, which was set to expire at the end of April. Margaret was put in a precarious situation. She had to move fast because in a few weeks she would have nowhere to live and no access to food. Although sympathetic, Sarah Pritchard told her that she couldn't jeopardize her own reputation and business by renting a room at the boarding house, providing refuge to someone who was deemed undesirable by the community. The economic reality was unavoidable, but it was a painful conversation for both of them, full of tears and heartbreaking embraces. Margaret made the choice that would alter everything at that moment. She went to Marshall during the third week of March to look for William Dockery, the county sheriff. William, a 39-year-old who had briefly served in the Army as a teenager during the Civil War, upheld the law in Madison with a blend of firmness and pragmatism. Margaret went into his office, a tiny space on the stone courthouse's ground floor, and formally complained. She said that the rumors about her were malicious and untrue, that she was being unfairly persecuted, and that her safety was in jeopardy. Margaret presented William with anonymous letters she had received, containing crudely written threats to burn down her cabin while she was inside, derogatory names, and assurances that she would never find peace in Madison. The correspondence was, not just because of their content, but also because of the intense anger that radiated from every scrawled word. William Dockery listened silently to Margaret, looking at the letters gravely. As a member of this community as well as a law enforcement officer, he was well aware of the tensions that could develop when an outsider questioned accepted conventions. Although his body language conveyed skepticism, he assured Margaret that he would look into the threats. William sat for a while after she left his office, examining the letters that were lying around, on his desk, considering his options. William went to see Reverend Morrison that same evening. Under the oil lamps in the pastor's study, the two men talked about Margaret Crowe's case. The Reverend insisted that the woman was getting what she had sown, that the community's righteous outrage was a result of her own immoral behavior. William, who was more circumspect, voiced his worries about the potential for violence. He had previously witnessed the rapid formation of mobs in small towns. How common people could become dangerous due to collective rage. William was reassured by Reverend Morrison that there would be no violence. He promised that the church would deal with the matter in a proper and Christian manner. They would keep Margaret economically and socially isolated until she was forced to leave. Physical conflict would not be necessary. Only strong moral and business pressure would be applied. William was only somewhat reassured after that conversation, but without any legal justification for acting differently. There was a false calm in the days that followed. Margaret was seldom seen, staying in her cabin. Despite her husband's cautions against getting involved, Emma Hendress was still curious and once climbed the hillside to see how her neighbor was doing. She discovered Margaret sitting outside the cabin, staring at the far-off mountains covered in the distinctive blue haze of Appalachia. The two women exchanged a few words. Margaret said something to Emma and thanked her for her generosity over the months. Would never forget that some secrets are too heavy to bear alone, and that mountains hold secrets. Emma felt a shiver go down her spine, even though she didn't fully understand Margaret's meaning. Those words carried a sense of finality, a suggestion of resolution or farewell. Emma had a heavy heart as she made her way back to her farm along the trail, feeling, though she couldn't quite place it, that something horrible was about to happen. Josiah Hendress arrived at Margaret's house early on March 28, 1898, to talk about the last specifics of the lease termination in the cabin. He repeatedly knocked on the door, but got no response. Josiah pushed the door open, which gave easily and was unlocked, but he tried not to show his concern. What he discovered within would alter that community forever and start one of the most unsettling cases in the history of North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains. For what seemed like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds, Josiah Hendress stood in the doorway. His His brain found it difficult to interpret what his eyes were seeing and to process the scene in front of him. There was utter chaos in the cabin. Broken dishes were scattered on the wooden floor, furniture was overturned, and ripped textiles hung from the shelves like eerie ghosts. However, his focus was on the fireplace, a stone structure that occupied almost the whole north wall of the main room. There was a burning thing. Despite the late hour of the morning, embers continued to glow dimly among the ashes, and the air was filled with an unsettling odor. Josiah moved slowly, his footsteps causing the floorboards to creak under his weight as he covered his mouth and nose with his sleeve. His stomach turned when he looked into the fireplace. There were pieces of something he couldn't immediately identify among the ashes and the remnants of burned firewood, but it didn't appear natural. Didn't resemble regular fabric or wood. With his heart thumping in his chest, Josiah swiftly retreated. He called and looked for Margaret, her name in a trembling voice, but there was nobody in the cabin. There were indications of a hurried departure from the second room, which was their bedroom. There was no bed made. The cracked mirror on the wall reflected only the mess that had been left behind, and the little trunk where Margaret stored her clothes was open and empty. Margaret Crowe had vanished. Josiah nearly ran down the slick path, stumbling over loose rocks and roots as he sped down the mountain more quickly than he had ever done before. He proceeded directly to the office of Sheriff William Docker and reported what he had discovered in between gasping breaths. William paid closer attention as he asked detailed questions concerning the state of the cabin, the remains in the fireplace, and any indications of struggle or violence. Then he got his revolver and hat, called his deputy, Marcus Flynn, who was 23, and the three men climbed up to the Hendricks property. Because it was a disturbing scene, the initial investigation was carried out with the utmost caution. William Dockery's knowledge of serious criminal cases was quite limited. Arresting drunks, settling fence disputes, and occasionally catching cattle rustlers made up the majority of his job. However, he was aware that he had to meticulously record everything. He instructed Marcus to make thorough notes while they looked over each cabin room. After being carefully removed from the fireplace, the remains were put in a canvas bag. There were pieces of cloth that were partially burned, charred pages of what looked like books or notebooks, and pieces of bone that were too small to be human and likely from animals. And something that deeply troubled him. What appeared to be human hair strands were so severely damaged by the fire that it was impossible to tell if they were still connected by what might have been a scalp. Refusing to go back inside, Josiah Hriss observed from outside the cabin. His hands were shaking as he attempted to light his pipe, and he was clearly shaken. He kept saying that he should never have rented that place to her, and that he had known from the start that there was a problem with that woman. William attempted to soothe him. Even his own words sounded hollow as he explained that they were still unsure of the specifics of what had happened. At once, the hunt for Margaret Crowe started. In order to search the trails that led out of that part of the mountains, William organized groups of men. There were three main routes, one that led east through deep valleys to the city of Asheville, which was about 35 miles away, another that led north toward the Tennessee border, and a third that descended toward Marshall. Every group got precise instructions. Seek out a dark-haired woman of about 35 who was probably carrying a trunk or suitcase, either on foot or in a borrowed wagon. The groups searched the mountains for 3 days. They interrogated every lone farmer, every family residing in the far-flung valleys, and every traveler they encountered. Margaret Crowe had gone unnoticed. It seemed as though she had just vanished into the bluish mist that always covered those old peaks. The searchers became increasingly frustrated, particularly when it started to rain. On the third day, it started to fall. A chilly spring rain that destroyed any evidence Margaret might have left behind and turned the trails into mud rivers. Rumors, meanwhile, were growing like weeds after rain in Marshall. The tale of the dilapidated cabin and the unsettling remnants in the fireplace spread swiftly, but like any tale repeated numerous times, it grew and became warped with each retelling. William was accused by some of discovering whole human bones in the fireplace. Some whispered that the walls were painted with images of Satan. A few claimed to have heard from someone they knew that Margaret engaged in sinister rites at midnight, calling forth evil spirits and sacrificing animals. The moment was grabbed by Reverend Ezekiel Morrison. He delivered an even more ferocious sermon the Sunday following the discovery. He said that something evil had infiltrated the community and that the only things that could save them from evil forces were unwavering faith and constant vigilance. He exhorted the faithful to stay vigilant, to report any questionable activity, to maintain there. Families should keep their doors locked and close. That Sunday, the church was full of people, both inside and outside, waiting to hear what the Reverend had to say. They were all looking for an explanation for the fear that had taken hold of their hearts. However, not everyone agreed with the story that was being told. The owner of the boarding house, Sarah Pritchard, openly voiced her skepticism. Nobody truly understood what had transpired in that cabin, she noted, and the remains in the fireplace might have offered completely innocent justifications, claiming that Margaret could have just left after the community had harassed her to the point of exhaustion. Sarah proposed that before accusing a woman who was no longer present to defend herself, they might want to consider their own consciences. Sarah's remarks were not well received. In actuality, her defense of Margaret did nothing but raise doubts about herself. There were rumors that Sarah had assisted Margaret and that she was more knowledgeable than she, was prepared to admit that her boarding home might have been used as a gathering spot for illegal activity. Sarah made the sensible decision to keep her opinions to herself, at least in public, as she felt the weight of ostracism starting to shift in her favor. Similar pressure was applied to Dr. Benjamin Clark. He started to notice that some of his regular patients stopped seeing him after cautioning against making snap decisions, preferring to travel farther to see other doctors in nearby counties. The message was unambiguous. There were social and economic repercussions when the official narrative was questioned. William Dockery received a letter 10 days after Margaret vanished. Without a return address, it had been slipped under the door and left in his office overnight. Unlike the crude threats Margaret had shown him weeks before, the letter was written in a firm, elegant hand. William read the letter 3 times, becoming more confused and uneasy with each reading. The letter was brief. However, each word appeared to have been carefully considered. It simply read, "Sheriff Dockery, the secrets you seek are not in the mountains, but in the hearts of those who remain." Margaret Crowe knew too much, and her silence cost her dearly. Search the county records for the name she never mentioned. The truth lies buried where no one dares dig. There was no signature, no date, just those enigmatic lines written in black ink on fine paper. William sat in his wooden chair for an extended period, the letter resting on it. His desk, as the dusty windows of his office let in afternoon light. Something about that letter deeply troubled him. Even though he was a pragmatic man, trained to deal with concrete evidence and hard facts rather than cryptic messages and ambiguous innuendos. A strong feeling that the case had more facets than he had yet to explore. Odd as it was, he chose to do as the letter advised. William visited the courthouse basement the following day, where the county's historical documents were kept, were retained. With wooden shelves drooping under the weight of decades' worth of paperwork, including birth and death certificates, property records, court cases, and tax returns, all painstakingly filed by generations of conscientious clerks, the room was dank and dimly lit. William started by looking up Margaret Crowe's name in the property records. He discovered nothing but the October 1897 lease with Josiah Hendress. His search was then broadened to include any document that contained her name. At that point, he discovered something surprising. A marriage certificate from Virginia, dated 1883, filed in Madison for unknown reasons. In Richmond, Virginia, Margaret Crowe, known as Margaret Ashwood, married Daniel Crowe. Daniel was described as a tobacco merchant in the document. Every detail was meticulously copied into William's notebook. What really troubled him, though, was what he discovered next. 9 years after the marriage, in 1892, Daniel Crowe's death certificate was registered in Richmond. The document's listed cause of death was unintentional arsenic poisoning. William knew what arsenic was. In grain and tobacco warehouses, it was frequently used to manage pests, and deadly mishaps were not unusual. However, a handwritten note in the certificate's margin was almost unreadable due to years of basement moisture. The Richmond Police Department conducted the investigation. Due to insufficient evidence, the case was closed. A shiver went down William's spine. This indicated that Daniel had been the subject of enough suspicion. Despite the fact that nothing had been proven, Crowe's death was sufficient to warrant a police investigation. With a newfound resolve, he resumed his search through the archives. After searching through dusty piles of old papers for an additional 3 hours, he eventually discovered something different. An official letter from 1897 between the Madison County Sheriff and the Richmond Police Department. The letter from Richmond Sheriff James Patterson notified Madison Williams' predecessor at the time that a woman named. It is possible that Margaret Crowe relocated to that jurisdiction. Although there was not enough evidence to prosecute her, Richmond police were still suspicious of her involvement in her husband's death, so the letter asked the sheriff to keep a close watch on her. The request to be informed of any suspicious events involving Margaret Crowe was made at the end of the letter. William looked through the documents. There was no record of a response or proof that the prior sheriff had even acknowledged receiving. The letter. It might have been overlooked by the previous sheriff, an old man approaching retirement, or it might have become lost in the bureaucracy. In the end, though, Margaret Crowe had been living in Madison for months without any authority figures. William came out of the basement with copies of all the pertinent documents, knowing that she might have had a troubled past. In an attempt to create a logical timeline, he returned to his office and arranged everything on his desk. In 1883, Margaret got married. 9 years after her husband's suspicious death, she reportedly lived in Richmond for an additional 5 years before relocating to Madison in the fall of 1897. What had she done in the 5 years that had passed? Why had she decided to travel to North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains? He required further details. In a thorough letter to the Richmond Police Department, William asked for all documents pertaining to the Daniel Crowe death investigation and any further details regarding Margaret. He was aware that weeks would pass before he received a response. Although it was a necessary step, communication between counties and states was slow at the time and relied on couriers who traveled by train and wagon. In the meantime, Marshall's life was having a hard time getting back to normal. People looked suspiciously at each other, locked their doors more cautiously at dusk, and spoke in hushed tones on the streets, all of which were signs that tensions were simmering beneath the surface. There was a widespread feeling that the community had undergone a fundamental transformation and that an innocence had been lost that would never be recovered. Emma Hendress started experiencing nightmares. In her dream, she saw Margaret Crowe strolling through the mountains in the moonlight, her form slowly vanishing until she was embedded in the mist. Emma's heart would race, and she would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in a cold sweat, unable to go back to sleep. The dreams started to have an impact on her health, but she kept them a secret from everyone, including Josiah. She, She started to avoid looking toward the deserted cabin on the hillside, lost weight, and developed dark circles under her eyes. The cabin itself turned into a morbid fascination. After dark, Marshall's kids and teenagers started challenging one another to climb up there. They demonstrated their bravery by touching the log walls before sprinting back down the trail, giggling nervously and claiming to have seen shadows moving in the empty windows or heard strange voices. Such expeditions were forbidden by parents, but this only made the cabin's allure as a location for illicit adventures. Reverend Morrison openly suggested that the cabin be set on fire, that fire be used to purify the area, and that nothing should be left standing as a reminder of that terrible period. However, Josiah Hendress, the property's remaining owner, declined, not because he had any sentimental attachment to the location, but rather because it would be easy to start a catastrophic wildfire by burning a dry wooden building in the mountains in the spring, when the vegetation was starting to dry out after the rainy winter. The cabin would continue to stand as a silent memorial to the unsettling events of that spring, at least for the time being. Richmond finally responded to William Dockery in the middle of April. The complete report of the investigation into Daniel Crowe's death was one of the documents in the package. William read it all more intently, making notes as he took in the case's specifics. With 17 pages of fine print, the Richmond police report was long and painstakingly detailed. At his house, Daniel Crowe had passed away on the evening of August 14, 1892, following 3 days of severe illness marked by convulsions, severe vomiting, and acute abdominal pain. His initial diagnosis from the attending physician was cholera, which was a common illness at the time, particularly during the hot summer months when tainted water occasionally caused outbreaks in the cities. Margaret explained that she had initially believed Daniel's illness to be a transitory one and had only called the doctor on the second day of his illness. Daniel was in critical condition when the doctor arrived. State, delirious, feverish, and severely dehydrated. The doctor tried to keep the patient hydrated and gave laudanum for the pain as best he could. However, only Margaret and Ruth Henderson, the housekeeper, were present when Daniel passed away the following morning. As was typical with deaths from infectious diseases, the body was promptly prepared for burial. 2 days after his passing, Daniel was laid to rest in Richmond's St. John's Episcopal Church Cemetery. The narrative might have stopped there. In an age when infectious diseases took lives on a regular basis, this was another tragic but not unusual death. However, Robert Thornton called the Richmond police 3 weeks after the burial with unsettling information. Daniel Crowe and Robert had been partners in the tobacco industry for 6 years. He told the investigators that Daniel had altered his will only 2 months prior to his passing, which Robert thought was highly suspicious. The prior will, which was created soon after he married. Margaret left Daniel's family members the majority of the estate, with a sizable amount set aside for herself as a widow. Everything was left to Margaret in the revised will that was signed in June 1892. To make matters worse, Robert disclosed that Daniel had told him, just a few days prior to signing the updated will, that Margaret had threatened to divorce him if he didn't give her a larger share in his estate plans. Robert claims that Daniel was conflicted because he loved Margaret but also felt manipulated by her. He had said that he occasionally felt uneasy about certain aspects of Margaret's behavior that he couldn't quite identify, and that she had secrets from her past that she had never fully disclosed. The Richmond Police Department obtained an exhumation order based on this information. 6 weeks after being buried, Daniel Crowe's body was discovered in September 1892. After examining the remains, a medical examiner took samples of the organs and tissue, which were sent for chemical analysis. Analysis to a lab in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the few locations in the area equipped with sufficient tools for poison detection. 3 months later, the results were returned, confirming the suspicions. Daniel Crowe's liver, kidneys, and hair all had elevated arsenic levels that were significantly higher than what would be regarded as typical environmental exposure. The quantity found was in line with intentional poisoning that took place over a few days or even weeks before the lethal dosages that killed him. Margaret was. In December 1892, Richmond police interrogated him. She was calm and collected, responding to questions with a firm voice and direct gaze, according to the interrogation report. She vehemently denied having anything to do with her husband's passing. She clarified that she kept a supply of arsenic at home for rat control, as is customary. She proposed that after handling the arsenic packets in the warehouse, Daniel might have unintentionally come into contact with the poison through tainted food or his own hands. Worked. In reference to the will, Margaret clarified that she had discussed with Daniel the injustice of giving his wife a meager share of the estate, particularly since she had assisted in running the company for many years. She described her conversation with Daniel as typical husband-wife talks about family financial planning and denied making any threats. The police looked for more proof. Ruth Henderson, the housekeeper, was interviewed and verified that Margaret had taken care of Daniel's meal preparation and medication administration throughout his illness. Although Margaret acknowledged that her employer kept some kitchen cabinets locked and that only she had the keys, Ruth hadn't seen anything unusual about her behavior. Ruth was unable to provide a definitive response when asked what was in these cabinets, but she could say that Margaret stored her personal items there, including medicinal herbs that she used to make tonics and teas. Officers tried to secure a search warrant for Margaret's home and look through these cabinets, but the judge turned down the request, stating that there was insufficient probable cause due to circumstantial evidence and ambiguous testimony. It was not illegal for Margaret to keep locked cabinets in her own house, and accidental exposure could account for the arsenic's presence, though it was dubious considering the quantity discovered. For months, the case was still pending, but there was no hard physical proof that connected Margaret to the poisoning, and no. The district attorney determined that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges against witnesses who witnessed her giving Daniel arsenic. Margaret stayed in Richmond for an additional 4 years after the investigation was formally closed in May 1893 with the notation, "Insufficient evidence to prosecute." She was supported during this period by Daniel's inheritance, which included the house, the tobacco warehouse, and several investments, according to documents William had on hand. Attributes. After selling the warehouse in 1894, she progressively sold off other assets. She reportedly left Richmond without telling anyone what had happened to her after selling the house in 1897. Feeling the weight of this knowledge, William reclined in his chair. Now he knew why Madison County had received a letter from the Richmond police. Margaret was more than a stranger with a shadowy past. She was a woman who had been the subject of a murder investigation, who had evaded prosecution due to legal technicalities, and who had purposefully selected a remote place in the mountains to start over, away from curious onlookers and residual suspicion. However, this brought up even more unsettling issues. What else was Margaret capable of if she could poison her husband to get his fortune? These discoveries gave new meaning to the remains discovered in her cottage's fireplace. The rumors spread by Thomas Whitfield, the visitors Emma Hendress had seen at night. William could no longer ignore the pattern that was starting to emerge. He made the decision that he had to take action based on this new knowledge. Despite Margaret's maiden name being a coincidence, William called a court meeting with Henry Ashwood, the county prosecutor. In addition to his work as a prosecutor, Henry, 47, had maintained a small office in Marshall where he served private clients after completing an apprenticeship with an older judge to study law. Henry was shown all the documents by William, who detailed his findings step by step. Henry listened silently, asking clarifying questions from time to time. After William was done, Henry was silent for a considerable amount of time, drumming his fingers on the table while he considered the legal ramifications of the situation. Henry finally said something. He clarified that they still lacked hard proof that Margaret had committed any crimes in Madison, despite this new knowledge about her past. Although the remains in the fireplace were unsettling, initial examination revealed that they were primarily the bones of small animals, most likely squirrels or rabbits, which he might, utilized for non-criminal purposes such as food. With the techniques available at the time, the amount of hair discovered was not enough for conclusive analysis. With the candor of someone who was acutely aware of the constraints of the legal system at the time, Henry Ashwood carried on with his legal analysis. He informed William that Margaret Crowe could not be charged with any crime in Madison County in the absence of a body, witnesses to a particular crime, and conclusive forensic evidence. The reality that she had. Although unsettling, being suspected of poisoning in Virginia had no legal bearing on any proceedings in North Carolina, especially since she had never been charged or found guilty. William contended that they ought to take action. A woman with such a dubious past had vanished inexplicably, leaving behind a scene that, to put it mildly, suggested dubious activity. Although Henry acknowledged that the situation was concerning, he maintained that moral concern was not the same as legal authority. He recommended that they carry out more research, looking for Margaret in nearby towns and keeping an eye out in case she resurfaces. However, they were powerless to issue warrants or pursue formal legal action. The two men were speaking when William's young deputy, Marcus Flynn, suddenly showed up. Marcus was panting, obviously having hurried to the courtroom, and his opening remarks made Henry and William jump out of their seats at the same time. A body was discovered. The three men rushed to Solomon Green's establishment on Marshall's Main Street, where a small group of people had already assembled. With his normally rosy skin now as pale as wax, Solomon stood outside and gestured toward the back of his store with a trembling hand. William moved to the rear of the property, where Solomon's modest warehouse was located, pushing past the onlookers and telling them to stay put. The body was partially on the dirt floor of the warehouse, wrapped in burlap bags. Margaret Crowe wasn't the one. It was a man who had been dead for a few weeks, possibly since late winter, based on the state of his decomposition. William started his examination by carefully kneeling next to the body and covering his nose from the foul smell. The man, who appeared to be between 40 and 50 years old, had a thick beard, dark hair that was streaked with gray, and clothes that suggested he was an itinerant worker or traveler. The body showed no overt indications of violence, and there were no visible wounds that would account for his demise. After looking through the man's pockets for identification, William discovered a few items, including a cheap pocket watch that had stopped at 3 hours and 15 minutes, a folded piece of paper with a name and address in cursive writing on it, along with some coins totaling $1.65. Margaret Crowe, Mount Mitchell, Hendricks Estate. Everything was altered by the paper. Henry Ashwood, who had accompanied Marcus to the warehouse, was shown it by William. The three men looked at each other intently. They were now directly connected to. They still didn't know who the man was or how he died, but they did know Margaret and a death. Solomon Green was summoned to describe the appearance of the body on his land. Despite his obvious shaking, Solomon was able to narrate the events with some degree of coherence. He clarified that he didn't often use that specific storage space. He stored damaged tools and things he intended to fix in the future in an old building at the back of his property. That was the only time he had visited that. Morning, because he was trying to find a shovel that he had put away months prior. He found the body when he opened the door because he could smell it right away. William inquired as to Solomon's most recent visit to the warehouse. After giving it some thought, Solomon replied that the heavy snowfalls had most likely started in November of the previous year. This indicated that the body may have been concealed by the accumulated snow for months, perhaps since December or January, and that no. The remote building was worth a visit in the bitterly cold winter. The investigation became even more urgent. William planned a methodical search for any additional bodies that might be concealed throughout Marshall and the neighborhood. Additionally, he sent telegrams to nearby counties outlining the man's discovery and inquiring as to whether anyone had reported missing people who fit the description. Marcus Flynn was assigned the duty of asking every Marshall resident if they had seen any strangers in town in the fall or winter, especially anyone who looked like the deceased man. The replies started to come in. No one knew the man's name or place of origin, but a number of people remembered seeing a man who fit the description in the fall. The owner of the boarding house, Sarah Pritchard, disclosed important details. In early November 1897, a man who looked like that had spent 2 nights at her boarding house. He claimed to be a spice merchant passing through the area and had registered under the name John Patterson. Area. He had inquired about women living alone in the area, explaining that he was searching for a distant relative he thought had moved there after becoming a widow, which is why Sarah remembered him. Always willing to lend a hand, Sarah had brought up Margaret Crowe, the only unmarried woman she knew who lived close to Marshall. The following morning, after thanking her for the information, the man said he would pay her a visit. The situation became unsettling after Sarah's disclosure. A man had come to Marshall with the express purpose of Margaret Crowe, or local unmarried women anyway. Apparently, he had visited Margaret after learning where she was. His body was eventually concealed in Solomon Green's storage unit after he simply vanished. Had Margaret killed this man? If so, how and why? That was the obvious question. To take a closer look at the body, Dr. Benjamin Clark was brought in. William and Marcus observed and took notes while he spent the entire afternoon working in the warehouse. Dr. Clark exercised caution and meticulous, looking at every body part that could still be evaluated after decomposition. He initially believed the man had been poisoned to death. He based his conclusion on a number of factors, even though he was unable to identify the precise substance without more advanced chemical analysis. The lack of severe wounds, the body's posture, which indicated the man had passed away swiftly and without much struggle, and specific tissue discolorations that were consistent with poisoning. In particular, Dr. Clark stated that, although he was unable to say with certainty without laboratory testing, the symptoms resembled those he had read about arsenic poisoning in medical literature. William and Henry exchanged a knowing glance when the word arsenic was mentioned. There was a pattern now. In Virginia, Margaret had been suspected of using arsenic to poison her husband, and now a man who seemed to have actively sought her out was dead, possibly poisoned under circumstances that, according to the paper in his pocket, directly connected her to him, William. Determined, it was time to significantly broaden the scope of the inquiry. In a letter to Richmond authorities, he asked for any further details regarding individuals who had vanished or passed away under suspicious circumstances during Margaret's years there following Daniel Crowe's passing. Inquiries concerning recent traveling man disappearances were also sent to counties in North Carolina and nearby states. William focused on Margaret's cabin in the mountains while he waited for answers. He planned a more extensive search than the first, with a focus on finding proof of poisoning or other wrongdoing. Dr. Clark and William Marcus were part of a 6-person team that spent 2 full days inspecting every square inch of the property. they discovered a number of unsettling items. Under a loose floorboard in the second room was a small metal chest that held glass vials of different liquids and powders. Dr. Clark carefully inspected each vial. Some of them he recognized as common medicinal herbs: chamomile for sleep, valerian for digestion, peppermint oil for headaches, but he was unable to visually identify the contents of 3 vials. After being meticulously packed, these vials were delivered to a lab in Asheville for examination. 2 weeks later, a messenger who had spent an entire day riding along the mountain trails brought the results from the Asheville lab. In his office, William opened the sealed envelope in front of Henry Ashford and Dr. Clark. His worst fears were validated by the report. Of the 3, 2. Arsenic was present in unidentified vials as a white powder that had been dissolved in distilled water to make a solution that could be readily added to food or beverages without being detected by taste. Strychnine, another strong poison that is frequently used to kill rodents but is equally deadly to humans in the right amounts, is found in the 3rd vial. The discovery fundamentally changed the investigation's focus. In addition to having potentially fatal poisons, Margaret Crowe concealed them beneath her cabin's floorboards in concentrations and preparations that indicated intentional and planned use, not just for pest control in the home. According to Henry Ashford, this, along with the paper connecting John Patterson to Margaret and the body discovered in Solomon Green's warehouse, provided enough probable cause to issue a formal arrest warrant for her. On May 23, 1898, Margaret Crowe was charged with first-degree murder in connection with John Patterson's death. All of North Carolina's sheriffs received copies of the warrant, and neighboring states, as well as a thorough account of Margaret and directives that she be deemed extremely dangerous. The reward for information that led to her capture was $200, a substantial amount that drew the interest of adventurers and bounty hunters from all over the area, but Margaret stayed unseen. Months passed with no confirmed sightings of her. There were sporadic reports of seeing a woman who fit her description as far away as Charleston, South Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee, even Louisville, Kentucky, and North Carolina. However, none of these reports could be confirmed. It seemed as though she had just disappeared from the world, or, as some superstitious Marshallese locals started to speculate, as though she had never been completely human. In the meantime, answers to William's questions about additional potential crimes started to show an even more troubling trend. In response, the Richmond Police Department provided details regarding 3 men who had vanished over time. Following Daniel Crowe's passing, Margaret moved there. They were all middle-aged single men or widowers. They were all somewhat wealthy, and they had all been last seen in the area around Margaret's house. The first was Albert Morrison, a hardware dealer who vanished in June of 1893. He had been observed going into Margaret's home for what he told a neighbor was a business conversation. No one ever saw him again. Police believed he had simply left town after his family reported him missing, something not unusual in a time when there were few legal requirements to notify authorities of changes of residence and a high degree of mobility. The second was Charles Pétain, a war veteran who vanished in November 1894. Several witnesses had seen Charles and Margaret together at social events during their months-long courtship. Then, all at once, Charles just vanished. He never claimed his war pension, which was still paid to his last known address. Once more, there was no reason for the police to suspect foul play, assuming Charles had relocated. Theodore Blackwell, a lawyer, was the third. He vanished in March 1896. There were rumors that Theodore was assisting Margaret in selling her properties because he had been spotted with her on multiple occasions. 2 days prior to an important client meeting, he vanished. Something wholly uncharacteristic of a professional who typically paid close attention to appointments. The 3 bodies were never discovered. Each disappearance was handled as a separate incident at the time, with no seeming similarity besides the fact that they were all about middle-aged men in Richmond. But now that time had passed, and Margaret's identity had come to light, it was impossible to ignore the pattern. After known contact with her, 3 men had vanished. William told Henry Ashford and Reverend Morrison, who had grown to be a powerful voice in the community, this information while she was living off Daniel Crowe's inheritance, but before she sold all of her properties and left Richmond. Community during the course of the inquiry. There was a mixed response. Henry stuck to his cautious legal stance, pointing out that disappearances did not prove murder and that it would be illegal to connect Margaret to such cases in the absence of tangible proof. However, Reverend Morrison's worst fears were confirmed, and he said in his sermon the following Sunday that evil forces had indeed been among them, and that the community had only been saved by divine grace from an even worse fate. The Reverend Marshall was greatly impacted by Morrison's sermon. As the months went by with no more incidents, the fear that had started to fade came back with a vengeance. Even during the day, people started locking their doors. Any outsider entering the town was greeted with suspicion and animosity, and women refused to walk alone after dark. Before Margaret Crowe arrived, Marshall was a fairly open and friendly village, but now it was turning into a closed and frightened community. Pritchard, Sarah, Hughes. Her boarding house, which relied on tourists and travelers, saw a sharp drop in business. Due to the unfavorable rumors circulating about the town, many people completely shunned Marshall. Those who had to go through did so as soon as possible, and if at all possible, they did not stay overnight. Sarah attempted to voice her disapproval of the paranoid atmosphere, but her words were ignored. Although she was not present, Margaret Crowe was the ideal scapegoat for the community's fear. 4 months after Margaret vanished, in July of 1898, an unexpected. There was development. Elias Drummond, a bounty hunter, showed up in Marshall claiming to know Margaret's location. Elias was a tough man in his 50s who had a reputation for always capturing his targets, regardless of the time or distance required. His facial scars told tales of violent encounters. In a private meeting with William Dockery, Elias disclosed that he had followed Margaret to Murphy, a small town in the far western region of North Carolina that is bordered by Georgia. Of the government. Elias claims that Margaret was attempting to start over in a place where no one was aware of her past while working as a seamstress for local families under a false identity. William set up a trip to Murphy right away. Elias Drummond, Marcus Flynn, and 2 other marshals he trusted accompanied him. Some of the most dangerous trails in the Appalachian Mountains were traversed during the 3-day trip. For the most part, they traveled in silence, and each man lost. In his own imagination about what might transpire when they eventually went up against Margaret Crowe. With only 200 residents, Murphy was a much smaller village than Marshall, tucked away in a slender valley encircled by mountains covered in thickets. They arrived on a warm July day at dusk, when the clouds were painted over the far-off peaks by the golden light of the setting sun. On the outskirts of town, Elias guided them to a modest wooden house with white curtains in the windows and a well-kept garden. William rapped on the door, his hand on his revolver's holster, hoping he wouldn't have to use it. There was silence for a moment. Then there were footsteps. She was there when the door opened. Margaret Crowe turned to face William, and her expression briefly changed. Maybe relief, maybe resignation. She didn't attempt to flee, object, or act as though she didn't understand why they were there. Her voice was clear and calm as she said, "I've been waiting for you." Margaret Crowe did not resist being taken into custody. William agreed to her request for just a few minutes so she could collect some personal items. She packed some clothes, a used prayer book, and a framed photo of a couple William thought were her and her late husband, Daniel. In better days, after carefully inspecting the items to make sure they were free of weapons and poisons. Curious about the presence of armed men in their peaceful village, neighbors started to congregate outside as she packed her belongings. The landowner, of an elderly woman named Abigail Foster, fiercely objected to the arrest at the home where Margaret rented a room. She insisted that the tenant she knew as Sarah Mitchell was a decent, diligent, devout woman who had never caused any trouble and who went to church every Sunday. Margaret was wanted for murder in another county, William explained patiently. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth in shock as she recoiled in horror at this revelation. It took 4 full days to travel back to Marshall. Margaret took a trip in a. Marcus Flynn was driving the wagon, and William and the other men were escorting him. Margaret was largely silent during the long drive, gazing at the mountains in the distance with an expression that was impenetrable. While the men took turns keeping watch, she sat awake by the campfire, eating little of the food they provided and sleeping even less during the night stops. While camping in a clearing with towering pines on the 3rd night of their trip, Margaret ultimately broke her. Quiet. She requested a private conversation with William. After some hesitation, William consented, arranging himself so that the other men could see them but not hear what they were saying. Margaret started talking softly, barely audible over the forest's nighttime sounds and the crackling of the fire. She informed William that she was aware that she would be hanged, and that she had no way out at this point, but she still wanted to tell the truth before they got to Marshall, before juries, attorneys, and the entire legal system distorted her account into something different from what it had actually been. Margaret waved her hand, dismissing William's warning that anything she said could and would be used against her in court. She claimed that there was a strange relief in being able to speak at last, that she had carried too many heavy secrets for too long, and that she no longer cared about the legal repercussions. Margaret started her confession by talking about her life prior to getting married to Daniel Crowe. She was the daughter of a tenant farmer who drank and had been raised in poverty in rural Virginia. Heavy, and when he lost his temper, he beat his wife and kids. Margaret discovered early on that women in that world had few options, that they were property that was passed down from father to husband, and that her only chance at security was to find a wealthy man and make sure he wouldn't abandon her. At the age of 21, she wed Daniel because she was drawn to his stability as a seasoned businessman rather than by romantic love. Although not joyful, the first few years were bearable. Daniel was a polite but aloof man, more focused on his business than his spouse. Margaret started assisting him with the books after realizing she had a knack for administration and math. She gradually became indispensable to his business operations, even though she was not legally entitled to the profits she contributed to. Margaret experienced genuine fear for the first time when Daniel started discussing changing his will to virtually exclude her and leave everything to nephews he hardly knew. She had devoted years of her life to establishing that company with him, and now she had to deal with the possibility that when he passed away, she would have nothing. At first, she hadn't intended to murder him. She claimed that she simply started to consider what her life would be like without him, and how much better it would be if she could inherit everything she had contributed to. You could easily find arsenic at any pharmacy or farm supply store. Margaret started by adding tiny amounts to Daniel's food, not enough to cause his death, just enough to cause him to become slightly sick and reliant on her for care. She gently advised him to reevaluate his will during these weeks of controlled illness, pointing out that it would be humiliating to leave his loyal wife penniless. Weakened and appreciative of her attention, Daniel consented to change his will. Margaret informed William that she intended to let Daniel live and that she would stop the poisoning as soon as the new will was signed. However, Daniel then casually brought up during one of their bedside discussions that he was unsure if he had made the right choice and was thinking of speaking with another attorney. Margaret became terrified. She saw years of preparation and effort coming to a head. She gave Daniel a much higher dose of arsenic that night, enough to kill him in a matter of days. She was terrified by the investigation that followed, but she remained composed and answered questions in a way that never deviated from her role as a bereaved widow. Margaret believed she had gotten away when the case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence, allowing her to finally live her terrible deeds had secured her life. But every day was a struggle due to the persistent guilt and the suspicious glances from Richmond neighbors. Margaret confirmed William's suspicions about the 3 men who vanished in Richmond. Before Daniel passed away, Albert Morrison had found anomalies in his business records that Margaret had made up to transfer money to herself. Albert came up to her and threatened to report her to the police. Margaret asked him to. Dinner to talk about a deal, and gave him wine tainted with strychnine. She buried his body beneath the wooden floorboards in the basement after he passed away at her house. It had been different with Charles Peaton. Margaret had in fact been courted by him, and she briefly thought about getting married to him so she could resume her regular life. However, Margaret had experienced the pleasures of wealth and was unwilling to return to poverty, while Charles was impoverished and only received a meager military pension. Margaret was terrified when Charles asked her to marry him. She had to tell him before she could marry him. Details of her history. However, she was unable to turn him away without questioning him, so she also poisoned him. This time, he buried his body in the same gloomy cellar after mixing arsenic with tea. The most difficult was Theodore Blackwell. He started questioning Margaret about the source of some of the money, inconsistencies in the documents, and things that didn't add up in her story while he was assisting her in selling her properties in Richmond. Theodore was becoming suspicious of her, and Margaret could feel that it was. It was only a question of time until he started looking into it more. She was so close to leaving Richmond with her fortune intact that she could not permit this. Theodore was the last person she killed in Richmond. He was poisoned and buried with the other 2. Margaret clarified that she sold the Richmond home as soon as she killed Theodore, before anyone could look for the bodies in the basement. Presuming the new owners had no motive to dig beneath the floorboards, they probably hadn't found them yet. She specifically sought a place where no one would recognize her, and where she could start over by fleeing to the Appalachian Mountains. For the majority of that evening, Margaret continued to confess, her words finally finding release like pent-up water. William mostly let her finish her story without interjecting, but occasionally he would ask clarifying questions as he listened in growing silence. Although the other men in the escort maintained a respectful distance, William occasionally caught Marcus Flynn looking anxiously toward him, obviously interested in what was being said. Margaret clarified that she truly wanted to start a new life when she moved to Madison. She intended to gradually assimilate into the community, work as a seamstress to maintain appearances, and live simply on the fortune she had amassed through her crimes. That strategy appeared to be effective for the first few months. However, after John Patterson arrived, everything collapsed once more. John Patterson did not deal in spices. To Sarah Pritchard, he said. Theodore Blackwell's family, who had never accepted Theodore's abrupt disappearance and suspected criminal involvement, hired him as a private investigator. Patterson had found the link to Margaret and had been hired by the family to follow Theodore's last movements. From Richmond to the Appalachian Mountains, Patterson trailed behind her. After months of patient research, he eventually found Margaret's cabin door. Patterson knocked. Margaret didn't recognize him at first, standing on the door that chilly November afternoon. In order to protect him from the fall chill in the mountains, she invited him inside and offered him hot tea. Patterson disclosed his true identity and mission during their talk. He clarified that he had information that connected Margaret to the missing attorney, that he was aware of Theodore Blackwell, and that he intended to bring her back to Richmond so she could face justice. Margaret went into another panic. All that she had strived for, all. This tenacious investigator was on the verge of destroying the lives she had sacrificed to secure her freedom and safety. She requested some time for Patterson to reflect and weigh her options. Patterson nodded, presumably assuming she was considering a peaceful surrender. Rather, Margaret made herself some tea laced with arsenic and went to her trunk, which was concealed beneath the floorboards. After unknowingly consuming the tea, Patterson started exhibiting signs of poisoning an hour later. Margaret observed with a blend of knowing that she had crossed yet another line from which there was no turning back. He suffered in horror and resignation. When Patterson passed away, she dragged his body down the mountain to Marshall after waiting until it was completely dark. Using the moonless night and the empty streets of the sleepy village, she was able to conceal the body in Solomon Green's storehouse, which she knew was seldom used in the winter. Margaret thought she had gotten away again that. Patterson would be long gone by the time her body was found in the spring. Then rumors started to circulate, aided by Reverend Morrison and Thomas Whitfield. The animosity within the community swiftly intensified and became unavoidable. Before the snow completely melted and the trails became passable, Margaret realized she would have to escape once more sooner than she had anticipated. Margaret destroyed everything that might link her to her crimes the night before she left. The notebooks in which she recorded specific financial records, including funds from the estates of the men she had murdered, textiles she had stolen from Patterson's home before concealing his body with the intention of using them, but discovering too late that they were incriminating evidence, and even a few strands of her own hair that she had trimmed in a fit of rage. With only the necessities, she left the cabin at dawn with the intention of disguising herself so she could get away without being discovered. She then followed the back trails she had discovered during her month's living. There, Margaret avoided major roads as she made her way south through the mountains, purchasing supplies in towns too small to be aware of what was happening in Madison. It took her 3 weeks to get to Murphy, where she eventually felt secure enough to relocate under the new name Sarah Mitchell. The months in Murphy were the calmest Margaret had known since Daniel Crowe's passing. She went to church, worked honestly, and formed sincere friendships with people who only knew her as the quiet seamstress who came from a northern location. A part of her started to think that maybe she could actually move on from the past and spend the rest of her life in relative peace, but she also knew that someone would eventually find her. Margaret was largely relieved to see William Dockery at the door. In ways she hadn't experienced before, the burden of having so many secrets, constantly being on guard, and never being able to fully trust anyone or give herself permission to form real connections was draining. Expected when she set out on that awful journey years ago, there was a sense of freedom in the possibility of facing justice, even if it meant being hanged. After Margaret concluded her confession, William said nothing for a considerable amount of time. Gazing at the woman seated in front of him, lit by the fire's flickering rays, he attempted to make sense of the seemingly composed and logical individual in relation to the horrific deeds she had detailed. She didn't have a savage or insane appearance, nor did she resemble a monster. The kind of look he'd subconsciously anticipated from someone who could commit several murders. She simply appeared exhausted, completely exhausted. He asked Margaret if she regretted killing the men. Margaret paused to consider her response. She expressed regret for Daniel, saying that he was a good man at heart and did not deserve the fate she had dealt him. She acknowledged that her feelings toward the others were primarily pragmatic. She had eliminated them because they had threatened her safety and freedom, as one would get rid of any other barrier. She was aware that this made her a monster in the eyes of morality and the law, but she had been taught from an early age that women did not have the luxury of morality when confronted with poverty and powerlessness. William couldn't respond to that. He was merely a lawman doing his best to fulfill his duties. He was neither a philosopher nor a theologian. With the weight of the revelations he had heard, he thanked Margaret for her candor and went back to the other men. Marcus inquired as to what Margaret had stated, but William simply shook his head and claimed that the court would make everything clear. The next afternoon they reached Marshall. When the wagon arrived, almost the whole village was gathered on the main street, as word had spread that Margaret Crowe was being brought back. Faces were filled with rage. People were yelling threats and insults, and some were just looking at the woman who had so terrified their peaceful community with morbid curiosity. In order to lead his men, William had to establish a protective cordon. Margaret made it safely to the basement cell of the courthouse. Margaret Crowe was imprisoned in a small damp cell with a single small window near the ceiling that let in very little natural light and stone walls that leaked moisture all the time. William brought 3 meals a day from Henry Bolton's tavern, a wooden cot with a straw mattress, and a bucket for necessities. Margaret spent her days reading the prayer or sitting in silence, accepting her situation without complaining. She had brought a book from Murphy. The trial was scheduled for early September 1898 to give ample time for the preparation of the evidence and the calling of witnesses. The prosecutor, Henry Ashwood, made a thorough case based on John Patterson's body, Margaret's confession to William, and tangible evidence discovered in her cabin. After all local lawyers declined to represent Margaret, a young lawyer from Asheville named Robert Mercer took the case grudgingly. Robert contended that the physical evidence was circumstantial, that Patterson's body could have gotten to Solomon's warehouse in another way, and that Margaret's confession had been coerced emotionally during a taxing journey. However, his heart was obviously not in the case, and the prosecution was able to easily overcome his feeble objections. 12 Madison County men made up the jury, and after less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Cornelius Watkins, a 67-year-old veteran of the North Carolina judiciary with more than 30 years of experience, imposed the sentence. On October 28, 1898, precisely 7 months after Josiah Harris found Margaret Crowe's abandoned cabin, he sentenced her to death by hanging. In a somber and solemn tone, Judge Watkins handed down the sentence, stating that Margaret's crimes constituted a basic breach of human trust and that justice required the harshest punishment. Margaret listened to the sentence without showing any signs of emotion. She stood and spoke in a clear voice that reverberated throughout the crowded courtroom when the judge asked if she had anything to say before being escorted back to her cell. Although she acknowledged that her sentence was appropriate for the crimes she had committed, she expressed hope that her case would serve as a warning about the difficult situations that women face in a society that denies them almost all opportunities and rights. She was merely acknowledging that, not pleading for forgiveness. Desperate decisions are frequently made by desperate people. The courtroom responded to Margaret's remarks in a variety of ways. They were perceived by some as a deceptive attempt to win people over. Others realized that the realities of women's lives at the time were uncomfortable. But the law was clear, and Margaret would be put to death according to her sentence, regardless of personal preferences. Margaret's cell received unexpected visitors in the days that followed the trial. Bringing wild flowers and encouraging words, Sarah Pritchard said that while she could, although she did not condone Margaret's behavior, she did see in her the woman who had been candid about the challenges of living alone in a hostile world. Emma Hendress also arrived, motivated by a combination of morbid curiosity and Christian compassion. She brought home-cooked meals and spent an hour chatting with Margaret about unimportant things, being careful not to bring up the crimes or the execution that was about to take place. Even Reverend Ezekiel Morrison paid Margaret a visit, albeit for a different reason. He arrived to rescue her. Soul, to lead her before it was too late to true repentance and acceptance of Jesus Christ. Margaret patiently listened, but after he concluded his impassioned sermon, she explained gently that she had accepted her fate on her own and didn't require religious help. During his years of ministry, the Reverend encountered many souls who were resistant, so he left feeling frustrated but unsurprised. During those last weeks, William Dockery also paid Margaret frequent visits. Having been the one, he felt oddly accountable for her, to apprehend her and listen to her confession. They discussed everyday topics, the passing of the seasons as seen through the tiny window of their cell, and recollections of places they had both visited. Beyond her horrible crimes, William found Margaret to be a bright, well-spoken individual with fascinating views on politics, literature, and human nature. Margaret made a strange request during one of these visits. She requested that William write to the Richmond police with the three people's location, bodies interred in their former home's basement. Margaret clarified that these families should be able to properly bury their loved ones and know what had happened to them. Seeing that it was the least that could be done to provide some closure to those who had endured years of uncertainty, William consented. After the letter was sent, William was informed a few weeks later that Albert Morrison, Charles Peaton, and Theodore Blackwell's bodies had been discovered precisely where Margaret had stated. The households were. Notification was given, appropriate funerals were conducted, and at least a little justice was done. However, the disclosure also unequivocally established that Margaret Crowe was one of the most prolific serial killers in North Carolina history at the time, having committed at least 6 murders over a 15-year period. The sky was clear and cloudless on the morning of October 28th, and the grass around the courthouse was covered in frost. They had set up the gallows. The executioner was waiting on a platform in the back courtyard of the building, a straightforward but practical 13-step structure made of thick wood. A crowd of about 300 people, many from nearby counties attracted by the case's fame, but some from Marshall, gathered to watch the execution. At 9 in the morning, Margaret was taken out of her cell. Her hair was meticulously combed into a severe bun, and she was dressed in a plain gray cotton dress brought by Sarah Pritchard. Despite having her hands tied in front of her, she walked with dignity and an upright stance. With his arm extended, William Dockery escorted her up the 13 steps to the gallows, each one resonating in the tense silence of the courtyard. Judge Watkins read the sentence again from the top of the platform. He then inquired as to whether Margaret had any last remarks. She spoke in a voice that never faltered as she scanned the assembled crowd, looking at both familiar and unfamiliar faces. She stated that she was able to face her fate fearlessly, apologized for the suffering she had caused, and acknowledged that her actions had been unforgivable. She ended by stating that her death would finally reveal the many secrets that the mountains hold. The rope was tightened around her neck, and the black hood was positioned over her head. Margaret Crowe fell through the trap door when the executioner pulled the lever. Her neck broke cleanly from the fall, and she died instantly. For 20 minutes, the body hung there as mandated by law before being lowered and given to Dr. Benjamin Clark for a last assessment. Margaret was interred without a headstone in a different section of Marshall Cemetery designated for executed criminals. Her grave was marked only by a wooden stake bearing a carved number. However, for years after her passing, people claimed to have seen a woman strolling along Mount Mitchell's slopes at dusk, always climbing in the direction of the deserted cabin that was never occupied again. Margaret's cabin stood for an additional 3 years before eventually giving way under the weight of snow during an exceptionally severe winter. The surrounding forest slowly reclaimed the debris where it had fallen. Nearly nothing is left to identify the location of those unsettling events more than a century later. Just a foundation of moss-covered stone and fading memories in dusty county records. Madison County and Marshall were permanently impacted by Margaret Crowe's case. The locals grew increasingly suspicious of strangers, more watchful for actions that went against the grain. Lessons about the pressures faced by lonely women, how society creates situations that can push people to desperate measures, and the value of compassion balanced with vigilance were also learned, though they were more subtly expressed. Before retiring, William Dockery was sheriff for another 12 years. Margaret Crowe, however, remained in his memory. He recorded all of his case notes in a notebook, which he periodically reviewed on calm evenings in an attempt to comprehend how seemingly many deaths could be justified by a reasonable person. He only came to the conclusion that human nature has depths that are beyond easy understanding. He never came up with a satisfactory response. As memories of the affair started to fade, Sarah Pritchard kept running her boarding house and eventually regained lost business. She kept Margaret's picture tucked away in her desk drawer, sometimes looking at it and recalling their discussions about survival and loneliness. At last, Emma Hendress stopped having nightmares, but she never once again saw the cabin on the hillside without getting a sudden chill. Thus, Margaret Crowe's story moves from the present trauma to the past warning, from living memory to historical record. She continues to be among the most unsettling cases in North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains history. A somber reminder that monsters don't always wear obvious masks, and that occasionally they appear perfectly normal until long-kept secrets are revealed. The mountains continue to hold there. Margaret's last words were, "Secrets." How many more mysteries are concealed in secluded cabins, far-flung valleys, and locations where the past is never entirely forgotten? Cases like Margaret Crowe's serve as a reminder that history is always more complex than first meets the eye, even though we may never know all the answers. Consider subscribing to our channel for more unsettling and in-depth stories if this trip through one of the darkest periods in American history affected you in any way. Post a comment with your opinions regarding the Margaret Crowe case. We would also like to hear about any other untold tales you may know that should be shared. By liking this content, you enable us to keep providing you with these intriguing and sinister stories.